Imagine waking up on a cold morning in a Viking settlement. Not as the chieftain, not as a bold raider with gold braided into his beard, but as someone sleeping near the hearth. No, not by the hearth. You're farther off, close enough to. Feel the edge of warmth, but not enough to forget the cold entirely. You're on a straw pallet that has long since given up any hope of comfort. It smells faintly of fish oil and sweat, and it crunches a little when you move. The fire is low. Your breath mists into the dimness. You're a thrall. That's the Old Norse word for slave. Bound not by contracts, but by force, by capture, by inheritance, or by the sheer misfortune of being born to someone who lost a battle. Your property, valuable, but not irreplaceable. You sleep where there's room. You eat what's left. And when the house wakes, you're already working. In the Viking Age, freedom wasn't a given. It was a privilege, a currency, in some cases, traded more casually than livestock. And for all the romantic images of long ships and horns of mead, for every roaring feast or saga of conquest, there were dozens of lives like yours, shaped by silence, repetition, and relentless labor. The Norse world thrived on movement. Trade, raiding, farming, sailing. Always something to do, somewhere. To go. And someone had to do the unglamorous part. Scrubbing, mending, hauling, tending the animals, making the cheese, chopping the wood, grinding the barley, repairing the nets, gutting the fish, and fetching water from a stream that might already be half frozen before dawn. That someone was usually you. You might belong to a single household, or be loaned out to others as needed. You might be whipped, though it wasn't as common as some imagine. Punishment took many forms, and fear of worse fates often kept order. There was no weekend, no day off, but there was the rhythm of the seasons. Winters were slower, if colder. Summers were brutally long, and in both, the work never really stopped. It simply changed color, and yet you weren't invisible. You were seen, though not quite regarded. Thralls could be named. They could marry other thralls. They might even keep a small pouch of personal belongings, hidden if they were lucky. Some were considered part of the household, as one might consider a dog part of the home, affectionate, even protected, but never equal. The line between person and possession was hazy, and always the knowledge lingered. If you disobeyed, or were no longer useful, or just unlucky, you might be traded, beaten, or quietly killed. Still, you worked, because working meant being fed. It meant not freezing. And maybe, just maybe, if the gods or your master were feeling generous, you might one day earn your freedom. Rare, but not impossible. You knew the house's corners. Better than anyone. You knew the creak of the beams, and the way the smoke curled just before the thatch caught fire. You knew which goats kicked, which children lied, and which family members whispered in the shadows when they thought no one was listening. You were always listening. You learned too, not from books, of course, but from repetition. How to tell when salted fish had gone bad. How to patch a roof with frozen fingers. How to make a weak fire last the night. How to keep your head down when the men came home drunk from the sea. You rarely spoke unless spoken to. But that didn't mean your mind was quiet. You thought of the land where you were born, or tried to. Maybe it was a green, soft place, or maybe it was dry and bitter. Maybe it was only a dream now. You thought of the people you'd left behind, of the name you'd lost. Or perhaps you were born here, a child of another thrall, with no memory of anything else. Either way, you belonged to someone else. And in the Viking world, that was as ordinary as the sunrise. So, when the rooster crowed, or more likely, when the eldest son kicked the pile of straw beside the hearth and muttered that the pigs hadn't been fed, you rose. You pulled on the same woolen shift, patched again. Last week, You stepped into the cold. The house was waking. The smoke rose. The salted fish waited. And so began another day in the life of a Viking slave. If you stood outside the longhouse just before dawn, before the animals stirred and the frost let go the thatched roof, you might hear something strange. Not loud, just the whispering hush of hands at work, always at work. And if you followed that sound past the coiled ropes and half-mended nets, you'd find them. Not warriors, not farmers, but the quiet engine of Norse prosperity, the thralls. Slavery in Viking society wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful. It was just there, as natural as fog on the fjord. The system fed itself, through raids, trade, and sometimes simple misfortune. You didn't need to be a foreigner to become a thrall. You just needed to be on the wrong end of a sword, or born to someone who once was. You might be a Slavic girl taken from the banks of the Dnieper, sold twice before she saw salt water, or a young man from the Hebrides, forced to serve the very people who burned his village, or even someone from Scandinavia itself, perhaps once free, but now too poor, too powerless, and suddenly owned. The chain wasn't always literal. Often it was economic, social, spiritual. A thrall might walk freely in town, might even trade in the market or visit a smith, but they were never out from under the weight of that invisible leash, the constant knowledge that they were not their own. and so much depended on who owned you. Some masters were indifferent. You did your work. You were fed. Not well, but enough. Others were cruel in quiet, clever ways, withholding, watching, reminding. A few were even kind, or as kind as someone could be, while still claiming ownership over another person's breath and body. Kindness, after all, costs little when you're in charge. In many households, thralls were woven into the fabric of daily life. They raised the master's children. They prepared the food, cut the peat, and stitched the wool. Their labor was the pulse beneath the surface. And yet, their names rarely made it into the sagas. Just blurred shapes in the background of greatness. The Norse laws had entire sections about them. What could be done to them, what couldn't. How much they were worth, depending on age and skill, and whether they were injured. A thrall who'd lost a hand, for example, was worth far less than one who could still haul barrels or churn butter. Value was measured in usefulness, not humanity. And the social structure wasn't just divided between free and unfree. There were levels. At the top, the jarls, the elite landowners, ship captains, and chieftains. Beneath them, the carls, free farmers, craftsmen, and traders. Below them, the lay-singer freed thralls, who carried their past with them like a tattoo. No ink could hide. And at the bottom, the thralls themselves. But even among thralls, there were divisions. Some worked in the fields, sun-scorched and bent double over grain. Others toiled in the kitchens, where smoke and steam blurred the lines between day and night. A few served in more specialized roles, metalworkers, shipbuilders, or healers, highly skilled and closely watched. And some, tragically, served in far more intimate capacities. That, too, was part of the chain. Still, every thrall carried the same burden. A life measured not by what you dreamed of, but by what you could endure. And so they endured. They learned to wake before the master stirred, to step lightly, to speak only when spoken to or not at all. They memorized moods. They trained their hands to move faster than their thoughts. They buried their laughter, their sorrows, even their hopes, except the one that whispered. Maybe someday this will change. But there was no Viking abolition movement, no swelling tide of rebellion. Slavery was too embedded, too ordinary. Even the gods, it seemed, had no quarrel with it. Still, in the quiet places, resistance lived. It lived in stories told behind stables, in small thefts of food or time, in runaway dreams that led some thralls to vanish into the forest, chasing rumors of kindness or kin. Most were caught, punished, some were killed. Others were simply dragged back and worked harder, silenced more thoroughly. But still, they ran, because somewhere, perhaps in the far corners of the world, there were lands without chains, places where a man could own his name, where a woman could carry water for her own fire and not someone else's. The chain beyond the shackles was hard to see, but thralls knew it well. It was in every glance that looked through them, not at them. It was in the way their hands were praised, but their voices weren't. It was in the silence after a death. No mourning, no burial, just a hole filled and forgotten. And yet they lived. They sang while working, softly, under their breath. They told jokes too low for the master to hear. They carved tiny runes into the back walls of barns. They watched the seasons change. They raised children, even if those children were not legally theirs. They clung to the fragile thread of continuity, because life, even hard life, still mattered. The chain was heavy, but they carried it. And in doing so, they left traces, not in the sagas perhaps, but in the soil, the hearth ash, and the worn grooves of wooden floors walked by those who were never meant to leave footprints. Not every story of Viking slavery ends in silence. Some crack through the frost, bold and unexpected, and perhaps none more curiously than the tale of Melkorka. She enters history not through battle or birthright, but through a chance purchase. At a market in Norway, a man named Höskuldur, a well-off Icelander, bought her as a gift for his household. She was mute, or so everyone thought, beautiful, silent, and foreign. A prize, perhaps, a mystery. She was brought to Iceland and given a place in Höskuldur's household. Not quite a wife, not quite a servant, somewhere in between, as many. Slave women found themselves. And for a time, she said nothing, not a word. But then, one night, when alone with her son, a child she bore by Höskuldur, she spoke, just like that. Her voice cut the silence. Her name was Melkorka, she said, and she was not born to bondage. She was the daughter of an Irish king. Sagas say she was kidnapped in a raid, taken from her home in youth. She had chosen silence as a shield, a way to hold on to her dignity, her mystery, herself. Whether this was true or partly true, we cannot know for certain, but her words reshaped her world. Her son, Olaf, would grow up to be called Olaf the Peacock, a man of wealth and renown in Iceland. And through him, Melkorka's name would echo across generations. But still, she remained in the margins, never fully restored to the status she claimed, never quite more than a figure of intrigue, a woman who bore her past like a hidden jewel, a story carved from absence. Melkorka's tale is rare, not because she existed, surely many like her did, but because her voice survived the silence. A name, caught on the wind, whispered through parchment centuries later. And in telling it, we glimpse something more, the depth of what was lost in every voice silenced, every life unnamed, every story that never made it past the longhouse walls. Imagine the creak of old wood, the slap of waves against a hull smeared with pitch, the smell of salt mingling with sweat and fear. You are at sea now, not as an explorer, not as a warrior chasing silver and glory, but as part of the cargo. It's a long ship, sleek, fast, built for raiding and trade alike. But today, its precious goods are not spices or amber or fine swords. Today, it carries people, slaves, bound or simply beaten into obedience, seated beneath benches, packed low, into the belly of the boat like forgotten tools. Perhaps you were taken from the Irish coast in one of the swift raids that came with little warning and less mercy. Or perhaps you were traded in some distant port sold by your own desperate kin, or captured in war and brought here by way of a grim deal. However you came aboard, your fate is the same: to move where the ship moves, eat what little is given, and remain still. The sea is not gentle. Waves toss the ship, spray soaks your skin, and the wind screams in your ears. There is no shelter. You huddle beneath furs if you're lucky, or nothing at all if you're not. Days blur together. No one tells you where you're going. No one tells you why. The rowers above you chant or curse or grunt with each pull of the oar. If you're not a rower, you keep your head down and your eyes shut. If you are a rower, you simply row, back and forth, back and forth. The work is bone deep, mindless. Salt crusts in your hair, in your mouth. Your muscles feel like they're being pulled apart. If you're injured, there's no treatment. If you're sick, you're left to recover or die. No one wastes herbs or effort on cargo. Your worth. Less than a sword, more than a sheep. Somewhere in between, as far as your captors are concerned. And yet, you breathe. You dream, maybe of the hills of your homeland, of trees you used to know, of the smell of your mother's bread, of a lover's voice. The past feels soft, like cloth rubbed too thin. And the future? The future is blank. Just more sea, more cold, more waiting. Occasionally, there's a landing, a temporary stop to trade or raid or rest. You may be ordered ashore to help unload, or simply left on the boat while others drink and laugh and forget you exist. You watch the sky change. You watch gulls scream and circle, and you wait. Sometimes other slaves are brought aboard. Their stories are in their eyes. You don't speak the same language, but you recognize the look, the disbelief, the mourning, the numbness. And then the boat sails on. The Norse had a vast trade network. Through rivers and fjords, down to Constantinople, up into the Baltic, across to the British Isles. Slaves were a part of all of it, quietly, constantly. A web of stolen labor and unspoken suffering, but no saga tells of you. The longship is sung. Oath, yes. The mighty seafarers, yes. But not the people chained below. Not the ones who kept the ship balanced. Not the ones who made it profitable. When you finally arrive, wherever that is, you're herded ashore like animals. You squint in the sun, unsure if it's morning or evening. Your legs shake from disuse. And then, a market, a master, a coin passed from one hand to another. And just like that, you belong to someone else. Again, the boat sails off without you, and the sea forgets your name. Not all slaves were warriors captured in battle. Not all were strong backs and calloused hands. Many were women. Many were children. And for them, the Viking world was not heroic or poetic or grand. It was a quiet, relentless erasure. Imagine a girl 8, maybe 10 taken from a monastery on the Irish coast, her hair tangled with salt, her face streaked with fear. She doesn't understand the words around her. She only knows she's no longer home. In a Norse household, she might be given a new name, a simpler one. She'd be taught to spin wool, to scrape hides, to tend the chickens. She will rise before sunrise and sleep after the fire's gone out. If she falters, she is beaten. Not cruelly, perhaps not in the eyes of her captors, but enough to keep her afraid. There's no schooling, no play, no dreaming. If she lives long enough, she may be forced into childbearing. Some slaves were concubines. Some were outright forced into marriage, their consent irrelevant. Their children might be born into slavery or granted partial freedom, depending on the whim of the master. Freedom was a slippery word. Women slaves had little control. Their work was constant. Weaving, milking, cleaning, childrearing. The labor was backbreaking, but never glamorous. Their stories remain largely invisible, preserved not in runes or saga, but in the quiet gaps between words, the missing names, the blank spaces on household records. Some tried to escape, few succeeded. And the children born into this system, they grew up in confusion. Some never knew any life but this. Others remembered flashes of a different world, a mother's lullaby in a different tongue, the shape of a father's beard. But those memories faded. The world around them taught them to obey, to serve, to survive. If they were lucky, they might be manumitted freed by a master who had some flicker of conscience, or who simply no longer needed them. But freedom wasn't a promise of peace. A freed slave, or Lisinji, had limited rights. They were not equals. They bore the mark of bondage for life. Their children did too. Even when technically free, they were still followed by the shadow of servitude. And yet the household depended on them. The farm functioned because of them. The Norse economy was propped up quietly by those who had no voice. They spun the sails for the Viking ships. They carved the spoons. They carried the water, tended the fires, ground the grain. Their work touched every inch of daily life, and their reward? Silence, no songs, no praise, no legacy. Just the hum of a spindle, the clink of a bucket, the sigh of a child carrying wood. And so we remember them now. because no one else did. Let your mind drift now to a Viking trading town. Maybe it's Hedibi, nestled on the southern Jutland Peninsula, its docks crowded with longships, and its streets slick with mud. Or perhaps it's Burka, an island outpost surrounded by the dark. Waters of Lake Malerin, buzzing with foreign tongues and clinking silver. There's a hum here, a rhythm of exchange. Fish for furs, amber for silk, iron for wine. And among all of it, in a quiet but persistent undercurrent, human lives changing hands. There's no grand auction, no raised platforms, no loud proclamations. The Viking slave market was more discreet than that. A whispered negotiation, a nod. Between traders, a handful of silver, a rough shove of the shoulder, and the deal is done. The thrall becomes property, no more and no less than a woven tunic or a barrel of mead. Imagine standing in that square. You've been walked for days. Your feet are blistered, your stomach hollow. You don't understand the language, not fully. You hear fragments. Strong back, doesn't talk much, used to the cold. You're examined like livestock, teeth checked, limbs poked, hair sniffed. You're not expected to speak, just to look able. You're being priced like firewood. Children fetch lower prices, unless they're old enough to work. Women are valuable for both labor and, grimly, reproduction. Men are judged on strength, health, and obedience. If you're lucky, your captor considers you an investment, something to be fed just enough to last. The currency is silver coils. Of arm rings, hack silver weighed on scales. There's no paper, no receipts. Your sale might be remembered with a gesture, or a knot in a cord. Or not at all. You may be traded more than once. From the battlefield to the boat. From the boat to the market. From one house to another. You're passed along like a rumor. If you were captured in the East, say, from the lands of the Slavs, you might have traveled far before arriving here. The Vikings raided deep into the rivers of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Captives taken there were marched north or shipped west, funneled through trade routes and spidered across Europe. These networks were efficient, brutal, and remarkably well organized. And they weren't just local. Some slaves were sold as far south as Byzantium. Others ended up in the markets of the Islamic Caliphate, where Scandinavian traders called Russ in those lands bartered their human wares for silk, spices, and silver diners. Slavery was an international affair, quiet, vast, and deeply profitable. But for the slave, there is no map, no destination, only movement, and waiting and wondering. At the market, there are others like you. You might find a shared glance with someone who speaks your tongue. You might hear your name called, by accident your old name, the one you were given before you became inventory. Sometimes you're sold with your kin, a brother, a sister, a child. More often, you're separated, permanently. There is no appeal, no court, no paperwork. Just the simple reality of being. Owned, the seller is not cruel, necessarily, just detached. You are not a person to them. You are a transaction, a number that can be added, subtracted, or lost. And so, with a final nod and a hand on your shoulder, you are led away. To a new place, a new life, a new master, or, more accurately, a new prison. The marketplace empties as evening falls. Merchants count silver. Buyers test the strength of their purchases. Slaves lie curled in corners, too tired to cry, too empty to resist. The next day, it will all happen again, and no one will remember your name. Now the wind fades. The sea is behind you. The market dust has settled, and you find yourself in a Norse longhouse. Long, low, and earthy, its walls are made of timber and turf. A smoky hearth burns at its center, fed with wood that you'll be expected to chop and stack and carry again and again. The fire never quite warms the corners. Shadows pool at the edges, thick with the smell of wool, old sweat, and smoke. This is your new home, not as a guest, not as kin, but as a servant, a thrall. You sleep wherever you're told, sometimes by the door, where the cold leaks in, sometimes in the loft with the smoke. If you're lucky, in the barn with the animals, where at least their warmth keeps you from freezing. You wake when the mistress of the house stirs often before dawn. Her voice is firm, practiced. She's not unkind, perhaps, but not soft. She expects obedience. She expects silence. She expects work. And so you begin. The longhouse is a world of endless tasks. First, the fire must be stoked. You use tongs made of bone and wood. You learn quickly that if the fire goes out, the punishment is swift. No warmth, no cooking, just a cold, hungry family and a colder, hungrier thrall. Then there's water to haul. Buckets from the well or the stream, heavy and cold, grain to grind. You kneel beside a quern stone, pushing the top stone back and forth, over and over, until your shoulders feel like they'll fall off. The result is a rough flour, baked into flat cakes or hearty loaves. You scrub pots blackened with soot. Mend tunics with numb fingers. Card wool until it's soft enough to spin. Clean the muck from boots, from tools, from the wooden floor. All before midday, you eat when allowed, usually from a shared bowl. Broth, if there's meat. Gruel more often. There is no separate meal for you, no consideration. But at least it's food. The children in the house might follow you. Some are kind, curious. Others are cruel, mimicking the tone of their parents. They learn early where the lines are drawn. You, standing just outside those lines, are their first lesson in power. The man of the house returns from his labor or his hunt. His boots are dirty. You clean them. His dog is wet. You dry it. His tools are rusted. You oil them. You are not thanked. And yet, you are always seen, watched, measured. You must be careful. Always careful. Not too slow. Not too fast. Not too proud. Not too clumsy. Your tone must be flat. Your face calm. Even when you are exhausted. Even when you are humiliated. The longhouse is not large. Privacy is a myth. You hear everything. Fights. Love-making. Secrets. Sometimes the pain of others. Sometimes your own. You survive through routine. Through repetition. Through not thinking too deeply. One day at a time. One task at a time. And yet, there are moments, quiet ones, when the fire crackles just right, when the snow outside makes the inside feel almost safe, when you sit for a moment with a cup of warm milk and remember something, your mother's lullaby, maybe, the way she used to hum as she worked. You are not free, but you are not gone. You remain in the rhythm of work, in the softness of spun wool, in the slow flicker of the hearth. You are still here, and so the longhouse sleeps, and you do too, for a little while, until tomorrow begins again. Now let us step softly into winter. Not a modern winter with down jackets and heated homes, but a Viking winter, merciless, skeletal, and long. It begins with a bite in the wind and ends in the bones. The air grows still, the days shorten. And in the longhouse, every task becomes heavier. For a Viking slave, a changing season doesn't bring rest. It brings new burdens, sharper consequences, and a creeping chill that never truly leaves the skin. If summer was a season of toil, winter is a season of endurance. You don't thrive, you survive barely. Outside, the snow piles against the walls. The sky hangs low, iron-colored, pressing against the world. Ice forms along the eaves, thick and jagged, like the teeth of some half-forgotten god. The forest is silent. The animals draw close. Even the ravens seem subdued, their calls thin and infrequent. Inside the longhouse, the fire becomes everything. Your mornings start with coaxing reluctant coals back into flame. Smoke hangs heavy in the air, making your eyes sting and your lungs ache. You squat beside the hearth, shivering, willing heat into your limbs as your fingers fumble with kindling. If the fire dies, it's not just discomfort, it's risk. Food can't be cooked, water freezes, tools warp, tempers rise. The chores shift with the season. There's less field work, but that doesn't mean idleness. Wood must be chopped, snow shoveled, tools mended, skins scraped, clothing patched, food carefully rationed and preserved, dried fish, stored grain, salted meat. You stir thick porridge with the same wooden spoon, morning after morning, knowing the taste will not change until the thaw. And still there is hunger. Not famine, perhaps, but gnawing emptiness. Viking winters were lean. Even the freeborn felt it, the shrinking portions, the skipped meals. For a thrall, his scraps became scarcer, the hierarchy sharper. There were no second helpings, no warm indulgences. You ate what you were given, and then you kept working. Your feet ache from cold. The soles of your shoes are thin, if you have shoes at all. Woolen wrappings help, but they stiffen when damp. Your fingers crack, your nails darken. You don't remember what it feels like to be truly warm. At night, the longhouse is both shelter and trap. Bodies sleep close for warmth, separated only. By status, you might curl up near the animals, their heat a meager comfort. Someone snores, a child whimpers. The fire pops in shifts. You dream of spring, but it feels like a lie. You mark time differently in winter, not by sun or moon, but by tasks. The next stack of firewood, the next feeding, the next stitching of a tear in someone's cloak. You fall into rhythm because rhythm is safer than thought. Thought leads to longing, and longing leads to despair. The masters grow restless too. Confined indoors, tempers fray. Sometimes the tension spills over. A sharp word, a slap, a punishment. Not born of anger, but of boredom and stress. You learn to read the signs, tight lips, tapping fingers, too long silences. You move more carefully, speak less. You are not alone in your suffering. The other thralls suffer too. A boy who limps now after falling on the ice. An old woman who wheezes more with every day. You exchange glances. Words are rare and often risky. But sometimes, in the early morning, when the house is still and the wind moans low, you share. A hushed laugh, a remembered song, a fragment of warmth not from the fire. And there are rituals. Yule arrives with its feasting and firelight, though not for you. Still, you feel the shift. The masters drink more. There are animal sacrifices. Songs are sung. Candles flicker against pine boughs hung from the rafters. You might be tasked with carving meat or scrubbing dishes, but for a few days the mood lifts. Even then, freedom is a far thought. The snow might soften the sounds of the world, but not the reality. You are a tool, a possession. Winter does not change that. But neither do you vanish. You learn small resistances. A whispered joke. A stolen sliver of warmth. A memory you refuse to forget. And in these quiet acts, you keep something of yourself. So winter drags on. The frost thickens. The animals grow thinner. You wait. Because eventually, though it never feels like it will, the sun returns. And when it does, you will still be here. Let us now return to the rhythm of ordinary days, the ones that don't make sagas, the quiet, endless repetition of duty that defines the life of a Viking thrall. Forget the raids and runnestones. Most of life was not battle, it was drudgery. And, as a slave, that drudgery was your entire world. Every task you perform is the task no one else wants to do. That's the simplest definition of your role. Whatever is tedious, filthy, painful, or thankless that belongs to you, you clean. Always. Cleaning. Chamber pots, woolen garments, cooking vessels, boots heavy with mud. You scrub with coarse brushes made of heather or horsehair. You scrape with bones. You rinse in cold water, your fingers going numb as you plunge them again and again into icy buckets. You tend the livestock. Muck out stalls, rub down sweaty hides, shovel droppings. Pigs grunt, chickens flutter. Cows shift and flick their tails, oblivious to your efforts. If a calf is born, you clean it. If one dies, you dispose of the body, quietly, efficiently. You mend torn cloaks, broken sandals, split buckets, snapped bindings. Your stitches must be tight and invisible. No one praises a perfect repair, but a failed one earns swift correction. You cook, not creatively, not with flair, with necessity. You stir porridge until it congeals. Skin scum from boiling pots. Strip herbs, crush salt, grind grain. If someone falls ill, you prepare herbal mixtures, not because you're trained, but because no one else will. You carry. Always carrying. Water, wood, baskets of cloth, bundles of straw. Your back aches. You adapt your gait to avoid worsening the acidies. Pain. You learn which door frames are lower, which steps are slick, which planks creak too loudly. You become part of the house itself. Expected, invisible, constant. There are no holidays, not truly. Even on feast days, you work more. The cooking triples. The cleaning intensifies. Guests mean more mouths, more mess, more oversight. And always more risk one spilled dish, one mistaken portion, and the reprimands follow. Sometimes there is no reprimand, just a look. That's worse. Children mimic the adults. They hand you things with a tilt of the chin, expecting obedience. Some are kind. Some are cruel in the way only children can be testing boundaries, copying disdain they don't understand. Your name might not even be your own. Slaves were often renamed. Black hair, ox, quiet one. Terms that described your utility or demeanor. You respond when called. That's what matters. You learn to take pride in small things. A hearth swept clean. A cloak stitched straight. A floor polished smooth. You notice details others don't, because you must. The location of every tool. The mood of every member of the household. You memorize footsteps. Know who enters by sound alone. Sometimes you're loaned out to neighbors. A day's labor in exchange for favors or goods. You nod, follow, do the work, return. No complaint, no delay. You're watched. Always, there is no freedom of motion, no idle wandering. Even your silence is monitored. Too quiet and suspicion grows. Too cheerful and eyebrows lift. You learn the balance. At night, your muscles burn. You lie on straw, or maybe a threadbare blanket. You curl around your own breath, counting tasks instead of sheep. And still, the next day, you rise, not because of courage, not because of hope, because you must, because there is no other path. Yet, even in this life, this grueling, repetitive, exhausting life, you carry something. A memory, a dream, a piece of yourself untouched by the daily grind. You think in your own language. You sing in your mind. You endure, not just out of necessity, but out of stubborn, quiet resistance. And that is worth remembering. There is a certain heaviness that settles over a person when they are owned. A weight not just on the shoulders, but behind the eyes. A quiet knowing that every moment, every breath, every glance you cast is borrowed permitted only so long as it pleases someone else. That someone is your master. Or perhaps your mistress? And in the Viking world, the master-slave relationship was layered with more than just dominance. It was tangled in customs, expectations, violence, and mood. For the thrall, it meant navigating a shifting terrain of commands and consequences, a never-ending social performance under the threat of pain. Let's begin with the law. Legally, slaves were considered property. This much we know. But Viking legal codes did not leave this relationship entirely unregulated. There were, at least in some regions, laws that governed the treatment of thralls. A master could be punished for killing a slave, but not for beating them. A slave could not give legal testimony unless under torture. A slave had no right to inheritance, to marriage, or to refuse orders. And yet, within these limits, the master held near complete power. That power could be wielded with discipline or cruelty. Some masters were stern but predictable, others volatile and dangerous. For the thrall, the difference was survival. Imagine waking to a day like any other. You prepare the hearth, tend the goats, scrub the floor. The master enters, his cloak dusted with frost, his eyes sharp from a night of drinking or brooding. You sense the storm. Before it hits, perhaps it's your posture. Perhaps it's something else entirely. He strikes you, not with ceremony, not as punishment, simply because he can. There is no recourse, no protest. You bow your head, swallow your pain, and continue working. Now imagine the master is not cruel, but kind. He offers you scraps from the family table. He nods when you finish your work. He even speaks your name, but he owns you just the same. This kindness becomes a different sort of prison. It asks for gratitude in exchange for control. You are still a possession, just one with polished edges. Then there are the unspoken games of power. A mistress might humiliate a young female thrall, forcing her to stand in silence as clothes are removed and cleaned. A master might take offense at imagined disrespect, a sideways glance, an untimely cough. Punishments vary. A missed meal, a locked door, a night without warmth. Or worse, some punishments were meant not to correct, but to remind. One of the most feared was the collar. Made of iron or leather, it was heavy, clumsy, and difficult to remove. It marked you publicly as owned. Some collars had bells. Some had names. Some were worn only during punishment. Others became permanent symbols of bondage. There was another kind of mark, too, the branding iron. It wasn't common everywhere, but in certain regions or among wealthier households, branding was used to mark a slave's origin or owner. A burned rune pressed into the skin, a letter, a symbol, a pain that never fully faded. And of course, there was sexual exploitation. Women were particularly vulnerable. A master could take his female thrall to bed whenever he pleased. Children born from such unions were considered slaves as well, unless the master chose to acknowledge them. That was rare. Most remained within the slave class, a cruel echo of their father's power. There were stories whispered in the shadows of masters who went too far, who delighted in cruelty, who used power not just to command, but to crush. A thrall who refused to speak, eyes blank from too many, nights locked outside in the cold. A young boy who stopped growing after being beaten for spilling milk. And then there were the small rebellions, the spoon buried in the ashes, the tool left out to rust, the task done slowly, silently, just enough to pass inspection. Resistance without revolt, because revolt meant death. The truly dangerous ones, those who ran or fought, faced brutal consequences. Escape was nearly impossible. Viking communities were tight-knit. Outsiders stood out. The roads were long, the forests vast, and a slave alone was a target. If caught, The punishment was swift: flogging, mutilation, execution. Some were tied to posts and left to die of exposure. Others were hanged. A few were sacrificed offered to the gods in rituals. That blurred the lines between punishment and pagan devotion. But not all masters ruled with iron fists. Some thralls were given trust, allowed to manage livestock, trusted to run errands, permitted to sleep indoors. These privileges were not freedom, but they hinted at something close. And in rare cases, they led to manumission. Still, even freedom came with limitations. A freed slave was not equal to a freeborn. They were often called lisingi, and while technically free, they remained tied to their former master's household. They could not marry above their class. Their children inherited their low status. But freedom, however imperfect, was still a dream, a whisper shared at night, a story passed from elder thrall to young, a hope carved into the heart like a secret rune. And until that day came, if it came at all, you obeyed. You worked. You endured. You watched the master's eyes for signs, and when you saw the monster stirring, you looked down and waited for it to pass. In sagas, Viking wealth gleams. Golden brooches, polished swords, jeweled drinking horns. But behind all the glitter, behind the clink of silver in a pouch, there is always a shadow. A pair of tired hands, a bowed back, a life not lived but spent. That shadow is the thrall. We often imagine Viking wealth as earned by conquest plundered from English monasteries, hoarded from Baltic raids. And while that's partly true, much of their prosperity was more mundane. It came not from the sword, but from the field, from the loom, from the spinning wheel and the grinding stone. And who, do you think, kept those spinning? The slaves. Every Viking homestead functioned on unpaid labor. Thralls kept the farms running while warriors sailed off to raid. They dug the earth, sowed the seed, harvested grain. They processed flax into linen, carded wool into thread, tended livestock, made cheese, cured hides. Every product that could be traded was, more often than not, made by slaves. Take, for example, wool. The Viking world ran on it. Clothing, sails, bedding, all were made of wool. And producing it was a labor-intensive process. Sheep had to be tended year-round. Their wool sheared, washed, carded, spun, and woven. Thralls did all of this. They sat at looms for hours, hunched and aching, turning raw fleece into usable cloth. That cloth could be traded, even exported. A family with enough thralls could run a small textile industry from their longhouse. Wealth was not just accumulated, it was multiplied on the backs of the unfree. Salted fish, too, was a trade good. Rivers and seas were abundant in herring and cod. But catching them was only the beginning. Fish had to be gutted, cleaned, salted, and packed. These were not gentle tasks, and they were often done in the bitter cold, in icy seawater, with fingers cracked and bleeding. Who performed them? Not the masters. In fact, many Viking trade goods, amber, iron, tar, soapstone, even honey, relied on labor-intensive preparation. Transporting them to markets like Hidibi or Reeb required long hours of packing, carrying, guarding. All of this was done by thralls or servants one step above them. Even the trade of slaves required slaves. Slaves were needed to maintain the farms that raised the food, to build the ships that transported captives, to row those very ships. Slavery wasn't just part of the economy, it was its engine. A wealthy Viking household might own dozens of slaves. Some would be artisans forced to create. Others were domestic cooking, cleaning, raising the master's children alongside their own. Still others were concubines, hidden from the counting, but crucial to the household structure. Slavery. also gave Viking men social status. The more thralls one owned, the more powerful one appeared. It was a visible mark of success. Just as gold rings or ornamented swords showed wealth, so did a retinue of silent laborers. They followed at a distance. They worked without pause. They bore no names, only function. And yet, despite their central role, thralls appear rarely in the historical record. They are footnotes in law codes, side characters in sagas, mentioned only when punished or praised for rare loyalty. Their contributions are erased, not because they were small, but because their existence was inconvenient to glorify. But if you look closer, if you dig beneath the gold and the blood and the legend, you'll see the shape of their work everywhere. The fields, the cloth, the fish, the roof above your head. Wealth is never just a matter of coin. It's time stolen, lives consumed, and in the Viking Age, it was no different. The Norse sailed far, fought hard, and built a fearsome reputation. But their longhouses stood tall, not just because of axes swung abroad, but because of hands were raw at home. Those hands, they belonged to the forgotten, to the ones who were never free, to the thralls. It might be comforting to think that people were always born into slavery in the Viking world, that it was an inherited condition, tragic but perhaps distant, like an old scar passed from generation to generation. But this was not always the case. In truth, many Viking thralls began life not as property, but as people free, whole, and unsuspecting. And then the ships came. Imagine a quiet village on the Irish coast. It's early morning. The mist clings low to the thatch roofs, and the sheep are still asleep. A woman stirs porridge, a child feeds chickens, and someone draws water from a well. Then a shout, then two. The sound of feet, of fire, of steel. Viking raids were rarely noble affairs. They were brutal, fast, and transactional. The goal was wealth, yes, but wealth meant more than silver and relics. It meant livestock. It meant tools. It meant human bodies, slaves, captured, shackled, dragged from homes, children taken from mothers, spouses separated. No time for last words, no mercy spared. For the captives, the journey into slavery began in fire and ended in frost. Once, on the ships, conditions were grim. The decks were narrow, the winds bitter. You were packed alongside other strangers or kin. It hardly mattered now. There was no room to sit properly, let alone lie down. Food was minimal, water rationed. Sickness spread quickly in the damp and salt. The Vikings, seasoned sailors, ignored your suffering. The crossing could take days, sometimes weeks. Some captives died before ever setting foot in Scandinavia. Those who survived the journey found no relief. At best, you were sold in a bustling port. At worst, you were kept dragged into the household of your captor, like a piece of livestock too valuable to trade. No one asked your name. No one cared. You might be renamed Blackhair, or Thin One, or Cow's Girl, or simply Slave. If you were lucky or unlucky, depending on how you measured it, you were purchased by a farmer, far from the coast, where your face would fade into obscurity, where no one would ask where you came from, where the old language in your throat would wither from lack of use. And then you began your life again from nothing. The trauma of capture, of course, did not end at capture. It etched itself into the bones. A mother might spend years scanning the horizon, waiting for a face she once knew. A boy, now grown, might count the winters in silence, trying to forget the name of the river he once played by. You see, slavery didn't just rob a person of their labor. It stole context, identity, the soft infrastructure of a life, the rhythms of a homeland, the scent of familiar bread, the comfort of shared customs. These were erased slowly and thoroughly. In Norse society, there was no ceremony to mark your fall. No formal announcement. You simply became theirs. You were pointed to your tasks, watched to ensure compliance, and punished if you hesitated. Some captives were sold multiple times, traded like cattle from one household to another. Their value increased if they had skills, metalwork, weaving, languages, but even skill was no shield. A clever slave was still a slave. And cleverness, sometimes, bred suspicion. Children captured young had the strangest journey. They adapted quickly, forgot the mother tongue, picked up Norse, learned to mimic the customs of their new masters. Some were raised side by side with freeborn children, sharing toys and chores. But the line was always there. They knew it when the freeborn child got shoes first, when punishments were unequal, when inheritance was never spoken of. And sometimes it wasn't raids that stole your freedom. Debt could do it. Or war, or famine. There were men who sold their own kin during hard winters. Better to serve and eat than starve and die, they would say. Sometimes people sold themselves. And yet, however it began, the result was the same. A life unmoored, no clan, no claim, no place to call your own. You might dream of escape, but the roads were cold and unfamiliar, the forests unforgiving, the punishment for flight severe. You might whisper your name in the dark, just to remember. You might carve it somewhere hidden, so that some piece of you still existed in the world. And this, the captured life, is the hidden spine of Viking history. For every bold explorer who set sail to discover new lands, there were those who were brought back in chains. And those chains, though quiet, held up the house. We love stories. We always have. The Vikings, too, were storytellers. They carved their tales into runestone, sang them around fire pits, recited them across generations. They spun sagas of brave warriors, clever kings, and fierce shield maidens. The Norse world is rich with myth and memory. Thor's hammer, Odin's eye, Freya's tears. But where, in all of this, is the thrall? The answer is complicated. In most sagas, slaves appear only in passing, a background figure, a nameless servant, a body that moves a cup, that opens a door, that disappears the moment the hero speaks. And yet, if you look closely, they are everywhere. In Laxdæla saga, a thrall woman named Melkorka is purchased from a market. She is described as silent, strange, a mystery. Eventually, it's revealed she is an Irish princess, captured and enslaved. Her son rises to prominence. But she never truly escapes her station. She is remembered not for herself, but for the noble blood she hid in silence. In Jarl's saga, thralls are killed during feuds named only in death. Their lives aren't mourned. Their deaths serve as plot points, excuses for greater vengeance. Even the gods are served by the unfree. In mythology, there are tales of servants in Valhalla, bringing drink to the Einherjar heroes chosen to feast eternally. Who brings the mead? Who clears the plates? No one says. It's easy to miss them. That's the point. Slaves in the Viking worldview were not central characters. They were instruments like a sword or a cart, useful, necessary, replaceable, and yet the sagas betray themselves, because even in their silence, the thralls press against the edges of the tales. Their absence becomes suspicious, their obedience too perfect, and in moments where they break that silence, when they speak, or act, or resist, they stand out like fire in snow. There's a kind of myth-making that happens in every culture. We choose the heroes, we polish their deeds, we ignore the mess. And the Viking sagas are no exception. They are filled with blood and fire, loyalty and betrayal, but they rarely tell. Youths who cleaned up the mess, who lit the fires, who mended the torn cloaks of men returning from war, who buried the bodies. Sometimes in archaeology, we find hints. A grave with a broken back, buried far from the main site. A collar rusted into bone. A worn comb clutched in a delicate hand once prized, now forgotten. And in these silent artifacts, we find the ghost of a story never told. The story of the ones who watched, who waited, who labored, who endured. They may not fill the sagas, but they wove the world those sagas came from. Without them, there would be no tailies, no heroes, no longhouses, no golden cups to raise, only silence. And that silence was always filled by someone. Long before the sun crept up over the Nordic hills, long before roosters stirred or ships rocked gently at harbor, someone was already awake. A thrall. The Norse word for slave was not poetic. It did not mask the role in noble euphemism. It was as plain and unadorned as the life it described. And that life began early. Imagine yourself there, just before dawn. The air is bitter with frost, even in summer. The hearth's fire has gone out during the night, and the silence of the sleeping house is pierced only by your footsteps, muffled against packed earth. You are the first one up. Of course you are. You always are. Your tasks are set, though no one writes them down. You know them like a song that never ends. First, the fire must be lit. Not a casual flick of a match, but the careful coaxing of last night's embers into fresh flame, blowing gently. Feeding with straw. Waiting. Watching. And if the fire died entirely, you might have to beg a coal from a neighbor, your eyes down, apology already forming on your lips. Then the water. You haul it from a well or stream, heavy wooden buckets biting into your palms. Not once, not twice. Over and over again. Clean water for cooking, for washing, for the livestock, for those who will wake up after you've already broken your back. And that's only the beginning. Breakfast doesn't cook itself. Grain must be ground by hand on the quernstone circular slabs, rotated again and again, hour after hour. Then comes the bread making, mixing, shaping, baking on a hot stone near the fire you built. You prepare food you will not be praised for, and sometimes food you will not even eat. When the household begins to wake, you are already deep into your labor. The master's wife may give orders. The master's children may tug your sleeve. The livestock need tending, and the dung must be cleared. The stench clings to everything: your skin, your clothes, your sense of self. Outdoors, you till the land, weed the barley, mend the fence. Indoors, you spin wool until your fingers blister, or weave cloth on looms tall as your body. The rhythm becomes part of your muscle memory: over, under, pull, tighten. The work is relentless, but not mindless. You think, but quietly. You remember things, but only to yourself. And so the day passes. Not quickly, not peacefully, but with grinding repetition. If the household is small, you may do everything. If large, you may be one of many thralls, each with tasks divided among you. But the hierarchy remains. The free oversee the unfree, and sometimes even the unfree turn on each other. Sometimes a favored thrall is put in charge of the others, a middle rung between freedom and misery. They may beat you if you falter. They may praise you if you obey, but their favor is never quite safe. A single mistake, a single rumor, and the illusion of safety vanishes like smoke. Punishment could be swift, a missed chore, a broken tool, a tone mistaken for defiance. You might be flogged, starved, made to sleep outside. No court would hear your case. No God would intervene. Not here. And what if you fell ill? You'd still be expected to work, perhaps more slowly, perhaps with your duties reduced. But there was little room for weakness in a world built on hard labor. Some masters cared, Others replaced you, and so it went. Seasons passed, marked by the cycles of toil. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant long hours in the field, sweat stinging your eyes. Autumn brought harvest and back-breaking lifting. Winter, though dark and bitter, did not bring rest. Wood still needed chopping, animals needed feeding, snow needed clearing. Even festivals were no respite. At Yule or Midsummer, the household might feast, sing, drink, celebrate. But someone had to cook that meal, serve that ale, clean up after the laughter died. Someone unseen, you. And yet, in tiny moments, life asserted itself. A song hummed under your breath while weaving. A few stolen minutes by the river's edge. A whispered word in your mother tongue to another captive. A dream, maybe, of a place far away, of a field once your own, of hands that once held yours. Not. Every day was cruelty. Some masters were fairer than others. Some households offered kindness in small doses. A warm cloak, a smile, a shared joke, but you always knew where you stood. You had no inheritance, no land, no legal standing. You lived under someone else's roof and followed someone else's rules. And yet you endured. Like the fire you kindled each morning, you learned to burn low, to preserve your embers through the cold, to wait, to last. Because while the Viking world honored warriors, it was built, quietly, on backs like yours. When people imagine Viking life, they think of axes and sails, of ships slicing through icy fjords, of warriors drinking by firelight, their hair long and tangled, their laughter echoing through the longhouse. But every firelit feast had its hidden side. Let's return to that warm longhouse, shall we? The smoke curls lazily to the rafters. The wooden beams creak. The meat spits over the hearth. Jokes are loud. Ale flows freely. It feels timeless, almost cozy. But behind the warm glow, someone is sweating. Someone is cooking. That someone, often enough, is a kitchen thrall. You see, cooking in a Viking household wasn't a matter of convenience. It was labor-intensive, improvisational, and often unpleasant. No modern appliances, no timers. Just you, a fire, and food that might still be moving. As a kitchen thrall, your domain was the hearth. You prepared the fire first, fed it slowly, watched the smoke to see if it rose clean or angry. A good fire was an art form. Too little wood, and the meat would remain raw. Too much, and it would burn beyond use wasting precious food and risking your own punishment. Ingredients were seasonal, limited, and often required negotiation. Salted herring, dried barley, root vegetables half rotted from the cellar. If you were lucky, wild berries, a bit of cheese, a rare goose or boar on festival days. But often it was gruel, stew, porridge, simple, filling, bland. Cooking required instinct. You learned which pot cracked under high heat, which wooden spoon wouldn't splinter. You knew how to time a stew, so the meat softened just as the flatbread browned. But you didn't eat first. Oh no, the master and his king were served first, then guests, then perhaps the other household members. You ate last. Or perhaps not. At all, leftovers, if any, scraps scraped from trenchers, the bones that no one else wanted. If food ran short, your portion vanished first. No one asked your preference. No one noticed your hunger. The kitchen was hot, yes, but not always cozy. On bad days, it was a battlefield. The smoke stung your eyes. Grease popped and burned your arms. Ash drifted onto your face and clung to your hair. The air choked you, but you kept stirring. You worked in silence or under the lash of hurried commands. You anticipated needs, measured quantities without scales, timed meals without clocks. You knew the pace of the house better than its lord did, and yet you were unseen. Sometimes the kitchen thrall developed a reputation. She cooks well, someone might say. Or, his bread is always light. Small praise, but dangerous too. If you were too good, others might envy you. If you were favored, others might accuse you. Poisoning food was a whispered fear. A blade in the kitchen could become a weapon, so even trusted thralls were watched. Especially trusted thralls. And yet, a kitchen had its small sanctuaries. The scent of herbs, the sound of bubbling broth, a cat curling around your ankles, the quiet hour before supper when the chaos died down and the flames glowed low, a secret taste of honey on your fingertip before anyone else noticed. For some, the kitchen was where identity lingered longest. Recipes from home, remade in secret, songs sung under your breath, a spice that reminded you of your mother's table. You couldn't say these things aloud, but they lived in your food, in the way you stirred, in the bread you shaped just so. You made meals for strangers who never knew your name. And still, you fed them because you had no choice. And because feeding someone, even someone who owns you, is still a deeply human thing to do. The Viking world was ruled by seasons, but no season held as much weight or as much silence as winter. To the modern imagination, winter conjures images of soft snow, woolen cloaks, and flickering hearthlight, the kind of cold that's romanticized. But for the enslaved, Viking winter was not picturesque. It was punishing, and there was nowhere to hide from it. Imagine the days growing shorter. The sun, always reluctant in these northern lands, begins to abandon the sky earlier and earlier. By midwinter, light is little more than a pale blue smear across the horizon gone again before you've finished your first task. And that task might begin in darkness. As a thrall, your work never stopped just because the land turned to ice. If anything, it became harder and colder. Start with your feet. Always cold. The kind of cold that doesn't sting but settles in, creeping up your legs like a fog. Most thralls didn't. Own proper shoes. You might wrap your feet in rags. If you were lucky, you had worn leather boots handed down from your master's sun-patched, brittle, but better than nothing. The cold found your fingers next. Tasks that had once been hard grinding grain, sewing fabric, chopping wood, became torturous. Your hands cracked, bled, went numb, but the work continued. There was wood to fetch, always more wood. You chopped it with slow, aching strokes, your breath rising in little clouds. You carried it back in bundles, your back bent beneath the weight. You stacked it neatly by the hearth, then went to get more. Indoors, things weren't much better. Longhouses were warm at their center, but freezing at their edges. Smoke from the fire had nowhere to go but up through the rafters and into your lungs. You coughed, but didn't complain. Thralls weren't invited to complain. You slept near the animals in the warmest part of the longhouse warm, but not clean. The floor was dirt, covered in straw. Your blanket? A coarse woolen one, if you were fortunate. Most slept in the clothes they worked in, stiff, damp, reeking. And winter was long. Weeks passed in a dim routine of survival. You cooked, cleaned, chopped, sewed, hauled, mended, and endured. And all the while, the world outside the door grew still. The trees bare, the earth sealed under snow, the sea frozen in jagged silence. Food changed, too. Less fresh bread, more dried fish. Salted meats, barley gruel. If the household was rich, there might be cheese or honey. But thralls usually ate what was left: bone stew, hard crusts, spoiled turnips. You ate quickly, silently, without lifting your eyes. And illness thrived in these months. Cold seeped into your bones. Children caught. Coughs. Elders died quietly in the corner of the house. If a thrall got sick, the solution was simple. Keep working. There was no medicine, no physician, just old women with herbs, and the hope that your body would win its silent battle. Sometimes it didn't. A sick thrall was a useless thrall, and worse a burden. Some masters cared, others quietly let nature decide. And nature was rarely gentle. But not every moment was grim. The household held tight to rituals in winter. Songs were sung. Tales told by firelight. Yule was celebrated, at least by the free. The great hall would be filled with laughter, ale and roasted meats. The thralls were still there, of course, but always in the background, serving, watching. Never quite a part of it. Still, the stories crept in, the sound of a lyre, the tale of a god or hero. You absorbed them, stored them, repeated them in whispers when no one was listening. Even in slavery, the stories had power. They reminded you there was a world beyond labor, a sky beyond the thatched roof. In those long months, your world narrowed. You didn't walk far, didn't see other villages. Your universe became the walls of the longhouse, the line of trees at the edge of the property, the rhythm of chores that repeated like ritual. But within that small world, small acts of resilience bloomed. A thrall woman might sew her own charm into the hem of a master's tunic protection, perhaps or spite. A thrall boy might carve a tiny ship from scrap wood, dreaming of seas he'd never cross. You found ways to stay human, even in a season designed to wear you down. You endured the quiet, because in the Viking world, the silence of winter was just a pause before another brutal spring. And when the snow finally began to melt, you didn't rejoice. You braced yourself, because soon the work would change, but it would never stop. The sagas tell of heroes, of kings, of warriors with blades and banners. But hidden between the loud victories are the quieter stories, the whispered ones. Stories of those who were silenced, but not broken. One such story is of Melkorka. Now, the name may not ring out like Ragnar or Lagertha, but in the folds of the Laxdæla saga, Melkorka waits quietly, her voice muted, but her legacy undeniable. She was brought to Iceland not by choice. She was a thrall, acquired like livestock, purchased by a man named Hoskuld, a chieftain in 10th century Iceland. Hoskuld bought her during a trading expedition, reportedly for her beauty. She was mute, or so it seemed. At home, she did what thralls did served quietly, raised children, obeyed without complaint. But something in her presence unsettled people. She carried herself with unusual dignity. She did not cower. She did not flatter. She simply endured, with eyes that seemed to be watching more than they should. And then the truth surfaced. One day, in private, she spoke. She wasn't mute, and she wasn't just anyone. Melkorka, she said, was the daughter of an Irish king. A princess taken during a raid, captured, enslaved, sold far from home. Her silence had been her armor, her only choice in a world where choice had been stripped away. It shocked Hoskuld, but he did not free her. Still, she had reclaimed something essential, her identity, her story, her voice. In time, she gave birth to a son, Olaf the Peacock, a name as flamboyant as the man himself. Olaf would go on to be a powerful chieftain in Iceland, respected and wealthy. And though he was born to a slave mother, that didn't erase his lineage. Melkorka made sure of that. She taught Olaf her language, her customs, her pride. She urged him to visit Ireland, to seek out her royal family. And he did. Years later, he returned to the land that had birthed his mother. He met her kin, claimed her bloodline. The saga tells us he was honored there, proof that Melkorka's story, so easily buried, still echoed in stone halls. So what do we make of her? Melkorka was never freed. She remained a thrall, technically, though her status was ambiguous. Yet she shaped a future. She refused to disappear. Her rebellion was not of the sword. It was quieter, slower, more enduring. She reminds us that slaves were not blank slates, not shadows. They carried with them languages, memories, skills, beliefs. They were not born as property. They were made so by violence. But even in that condition, some held tight to the core of who they were. Melkorka reminds us that slavery wasn't always a final sentence. That identity, though battered, could endure. She became a ghost in the sagas, haunting them gently. Not seeking revenge, just recognition. And now, more than 1,000 years later, we remember her. Not just because she was a king's daughter, but because she kept that truth alive in a place that tried to strip it from her. And maybe, in the end, that's the most Viking thing of all, not pillaging, but surviving quietly. Beneath the fields and fjords of Scandinavia, the ground remembers more than the living do. While the sagas sang of war and glory, the earth quietly cradled the forgotten, the ones who tilled the land, bore the burdens, and left behind bones, instead of names. And if you listen softly, carefully, archaeologists will tell you what the soil has whispered. The signs of Viking slavery are subtle, but persistent. They do not shout. They murmur. A grave, for example, is not always what it seems. In many parts of the Viking world, the dead were given proper send-offs, buried with care, adorned with grave goods, swords, brooches, combs, coins, beads, sometimes even animals or entire ships. These were signals of status, of remembrance, being part of the story. But scattered among these honored burials are the others, shallow pits, bodies without adornment, burials without markers. Sometimes no grave at all, just remains found discarded in ditches, at the edge of settlements, even thrown into wells. These bones tell a story the sagas omitted. At Rib in Denmark, a man was found buried with his legs bound. No grave goods, just a skeleton, curled in a posture of submission. In Iceland, bodies have been found in positions that suggest no ceremony, no farewell. And across Scandinavia, particularly near wealthy farms, archaeologists have found signs of punishment. Bone fractures that had healed badly, suggesting harsh beatings. Signs of malnutrition, stunted growth. And then there are the brands. Some Viking thralls were tattooed or marked to show ownership. Though soft tissue rarely survives the centuries, a few bone finds show unusual burn marks or scarring consistent. With heated metal, it's not definitive, but it's suggestive. Branding is, after all, one of humanity's oldest, cruelest inventions. DNA analysis has added another layer. In recent years, genetic studies of Viking graves have revealed people. From far beyond Scandinavia, Eastern Europeans, Britons, Irish, Sami, and even Central Asians. Some of these individuals were buried in high-status graves, but others buried far from family, nameless, unadorned. Their presence hints at how deeply the Viking slave trade reached, how many were swept into it, and how many disappeared without trace. One chilling discovery comes from Birka, the trading town on a Swedish island. Among the many graves there, archaeologists found a woman buried with rich ornaments, clearly someone of significance. But in a nearby pit, they found another woman. No goods, no markers, a skeleton with signs of long-term stress and hard labor. She may have lived in the same household, one mistress, one thrall. No saga speaks their names, but together their bones whisper of the hierarchy that ruled Viking homes. Some graves offer glimpses of rebellion. A body stabbed and hastily buried near a longhouse wall. Was it a murder? A punished runaway? A slave who fought back? We may never know. But these moments hint at the emotional undercurrent behind slavery. Not just endurance, but resentment, fury, despair, resistance. And yet, perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the absences. There are fewer slave burials than we'd expect, given how essential they were to Viking society. Where are the rest? Discarded? Burned without right? Buried? Together in mass graves, long eroded by time? Archaeology doesn't offer certainty, only fragments. A chipped tooth here, a worn vertebra there, a dislocated joint, an iron shackle, a child's bead repurposed as an earring by someone who had nothing else to call their own. Still, these fragments matter. They shift the story. They remind us that beneath every Viking estate, every great hall, every ruin-covered monument, there was labor, hidden labor, enslaved labor, the work of hands that never held power, and feet that walked roads not by choice, but by command. And they remind us of something else. That history, though often written by the victors, is buried by everyone, even those who were never meant to be remembered, especially them. Let us step out of the fields, away from the smoke of the hearths, and into the carved thresholds of the elite Viking world. Picture a longhouse unlike the others, taller, wider. Its roof beams high above the floor, the walls painted with imported red ochre, the doorway adorned with intricate wooden knotwork. This is the home of a Gogia chieftain, a landowner, a man whose word carries weight, whose wealth shapes the valley. Inside, the air smells not just of wood smoke and wool, but of cured leather, imported spices, beeswax candles. There are furs here soft and warm, iron tools, glass beads, occasionally a silver coin. These things did not appear by accident. They were built on the backs of others. Slavery was not merely tolerated in Viking society. It was a sign of status. To own thralls was to be powerful. It meant your land was large enough to need help. It meant your household was busy enough to require hands. And it meant that your wealth allowed you to purchase human lives just as easily as you might buy cattle or cloth. Elite Viking homes often had entire outbuildings for their enslaved workers, small, windowless structures that housed those who cleaned, cooked, tended the livestock, and kept the estate running. Sometimes they slept near the animals, sometimes in the cold corners of the main hall. Rarely, if ever, were they given private space. In these households, the work was constant. The mistress of the hall might be spinning fine thread, discussing alliances. Meanwhile, her thrall was behind her, carding wool, preparing the dyes, fetching water from the well. The master might be sharpening weapons, readying for a journey. Behind him, a thrall cleaned his armor, packed the provisions, polished the silver. Slavery extended beyond the domestic. In wealthier homes, thralls served as bodyguards, executioners, concubines. They were assigned the dirtiest tasks, but also the most dangerous ones. If a chieftain needed someone to light a fire in a collapsed mine shaft or retrieve a body from a frozen lake, a thrall would be chosen. And the punishments? The elite had authority not only to command, but to discipline. A thrall who disobeyed could be flogged, maimed, even killed with no legal repercussions. Icelandic law codes mention fines for killing another man's slave, but not for harming your own. They were, legally, property. And property does not feel pain, at least not officially. Yet some elites developed attachments. There are records rare, but real of masters freeing favored thralls, of gifting land, even arranging marriages. But such gestures were acts of whim, not justice. A slave's freedom was never a right. It was mercy. And mercy was scarce. Still, a strange dependency existed. Viking lords relied on their enslaved labor as much as they lorded over it. Their homes, their feasts, their travel, even their raids all required organization, support, and background labor. Behind every Viking expedition was a thrall sharpening blades. Behind every feast, a thrall sweating over boiling pots. Behind every embroidered cloak, a pair of hands that would never wear one. So while the sagas praised the chieftains for their wisdom, bravery, and might, they forgot to mention the figures in the shadows, the ones who lit the fires before dawn, who carried the burdens without, thanks, who kept the elite world spinning so it could look effortless. The slave was always there, just not in the story. Until now. Imagine, if you will, a port town in the Viking Age somewhere like Hidibi or Kopang, nestled beside gray waters under a sky heavy with mist. The harbor is a forest of masts and sails. Crates of furs, amber, and glass beads pile near the docks. There's the smell of fish, of tarred ropes, and wet wool. But beneath it all, a quieter, more unsettling exchange unfolds. People are for sale here. The slave trade in the Viking world wasn't hidden. It wasn't shameful. It was business. Open, practiced, and profitable. You wouldn't have seen wooden stages or shouted auctions like in more recent centuries. Number. Velvet hammer, no red flags. The trade was quieter, subtler, but just as cruel. A wealthy merchant might arrive with a boatload of goods, silks from Byzantium, spices from the East, wine sealed in clay jars. Alongside the cargo, a handful of captives, some shackled, some not, stood silently, waiting to be exchanged. They were the spoils of raids, or purchased from distant lands, or born into it, men and women, children. A fair-haired girl from an Irish monastery, a Slavic boy taken from a border village, a Sami hunter sold by his own tribe, some barely teenagers, others old enough to remember what they'd lost. Prices varied. Young, strong men fetched at the highest rates. They could work the hardest, survive the longest. Women were prized not just for labor, but for what the records politely call service. A child, tragically, was a long-term investment. Cheaper up front, but more profitable in the long run. Barter was common. A merchant might trade one slave for 3 dozen wool cloaks, or a well-trained female cook for a chest of Frankish coins. The value of human life was measured in livestock, in tools, in silver rings. Sometimes a thrall was branded, marked with hot iron to ensure no one would mistake them for a free person. The mark might be a rune, a line, a symbol, just enough to tell the world who owned you. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they were tattooed instead, less painful, more artistic. But make no mistake, neither one offered dignity. They were both declarations of possession. Viking merchants weren't alone in this practice. They traded slaves to the Arabs, the Byzantines, and even fellow Northern Europeans. In the great markets of Novgorod, Kiev, and Constantinople, Norse traders brought more than honey and furs. They brought people. It was a strange irony. In a culture that valued honor, loyalty, and kin, so many were willing to trade flesh for coin. And yet, perhaps it wasn't strange at all. Honor was reserved for the in-group, the clan, the tribe. Those outside it, foreigners, the conquered, the unlucky, were another matter. They weren't people. They were property. Some laws reflect this stark reality. Icelandic legal texts mention rules for slave purchase, how to prove ownership, what to do if a thrall escaped. There were even return policies. If a slave turned out to be sick or deformed, a buyer could, in some cases, return them like a faulty cartwheel. The emotional cost of such transactions rarely appears in the records. But you can imagine it? Picture a child watching her mother sold to another household. A young man traded away from his sister. A wife offered in payment for her husband's. Debts. The pain was quiet, dignified, out of sight. Not all transactions were cruelly abrupt. Some slaves were raised in households from birth. They were never kidnapped, never bound. But even then, they understood the hierarchy. They knew they were not kin, not equal. They were furniture with a heartbeat. They ate last. They worked longest. They obeyed without question. Still, in markets, like Hidibi and beyond, moments of rebellion flickered. A slave might try to flee during a crowded trade day, might steal a knife, might whisper in a potential buyer's ear, begging for a kinder fate. Such moments were rare, risky. Most didn't end well, but they happened. Enough to unsettle the illusion that the market was only about goods. Because here's the thing about buying and selling people. They remember. The ones traded like cattle never forgot what it meant. And even centuries later, the quiet dignity of their suffering haunts the edges of Viking glory. So the next time someone praises the boldness of the Norse merchants, the scope of their trading empire, the silver hoards glittering in museum cases, remember what was often left unsaid. Not everything that glitters was earned cleanly, and some of the most valuable things in Viking markets could cry. Now let's shift our view from the markets of exchange to the very beginning of the journey. Before the sales, before the branding, before the silent stares across market stalls. Imagine a village. Small, peaceful, half asleep beneath early. Morning mist. The birds haven't yet scattered. The sheep bleat quietly from their pens. A woman stirs a pot over a fire, humming. Children chase each other through damp grass. Then a sound, not thunder, not horses. Something different. Paddles slicing water, and then chaos. The longships arrive like dark wings across the bay. Warriors. Corps ashore. The clash of iron, the crackle of fire, the screams of the waking. This was how many entered the Viking slave system. Not by death or birth, but by force. The Viking raids, so often romanticized, were acts of violence first and foremost. Their purpose? Wealth. And slaves were wealth. Monasteries were prime targets. Isolated, wealthy, poorly defended. But villages, too, were vulnerable. The raiders weren't looking to destroy everything, just to take what was portable, and that included people. Able-bodied men might be killed if they resisted. The rest, particularly women and children, were bound, tied, and herded aboard. There was no trial, no conversation, just capture. The longship, designed for speed, offered little comfort. The captives huddled at the center, among bundles of loot, livestock, barrels of water. Some were seasick, others dazed from head wounds. Crying was common at first, then silence. The Vikings didn't coddle their human cargo. Food was sparse. Space was tighter than a grain silo. No bedding, no privacy. Just the cold press of others, the slap of waves, the sting of salt in wounds. For days or weeks, the captives would drift, like shadows through the North Sea fog, uncertain where they were going or why. Most didn't speak Norse. They couldn't understand their captors, nor beg for mercy in their language. And so they watched the rhythm of the rowing, the singing of the warriors, the sharpening of blades, all of it alien, all of it terrifying. And then the shore, not their home, but someone else's. Some were brought to Viking homesteads to work, others to markets, a few to be given as gifts to solidify alliances. Still others were taken further across rivers into the Rus lands, or down to Byzantium, to the sprawling city of Constantinople, where exotic slaves fetched exotic prices. This journey was a tearing, from land, from family, from self. Even the strong were remade by it. They emerged on the other side, not as who they had been, but as property. Their name, their past, even their gods left behind on the shore. Now, ashes, and yet something endured. A memory. A language whispered to oneself at night. A song half remembered. Even bound, people held on to the idea of themselves tucked away like a kernel of wheat in winter, waiting for spring. But spring didn't always come. Some lived out their lives in foreign lands. Others died before ever reaching one. Most became footnotes, known only by profession or price. But every slave's journey began somewhere. A raid, a scream. A longship. Slicing water, the Viking Age expanded a world. But it shrank so many within it. Imagine the dim glow of a hearth fire in a Viking longhouse. Smoke curls lazily toward the rafters, escaping through a narrow smoke hole in the roof. The walls are thick with soot, the benches lined with furs, gone stiff from cold and sweat. A stew pot simmers onion, barley, something salted and stringy that might once have been fish. And in the corner, unnoticed, a thrall rises before dawn. Her name doesn't matter to the people she serves. Perhaps she had another name, once Irish, Slavic, Anglo-Saxon, or Finnish. Now, she's just the girl, or the cook, or the slave. Daily life for a thrall within a Viking household was quiet, repetitive, and exhausting. She might begin her day crushing grain with heavy stones, her back already aching from yesterday. Water had to be fetched from the stream, firewood chopped, and carried, animal pens mucked out. All this before the household even stirred. There were no weekends, no holidays, no idle hands. Winter made things worse. During those long, dark months when the sun barely crept above the horizon and frost laced every beam, work didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Thralls rose first to stoke the fire. They broke the ice on the water barrel. They trudged through snow to tend the animals. Their hands cracked from cold, their nails blackened from soot. There was no space for complaint, no time for stillness. They were not part of the family, though they lived beside it. At meals, they sat separately, often on the ground. They ate last, sometimes only after the dogs. Their bowls were wooden, often chipped, and their portions meager. Meat was rare, unless the household was especially rich or someone died. A thrall who served indoors might have it better than one who worked in the fields or stables. Still, better is relative. Tasks indoors involved endless cleaning, fire tending, wool carding, spinning, cooking, and keeping the infants of the household from rolling into the flames. In many homes, thralls shared quarters with livestock. Chickens roosted near their feet. Goats jostled them in the night. Rats skittered above the rafters. Privacy was a luxury they forgot to imagine. Sometimes the work shifted depending on gender. Male thralls often labored outside cutting peat, hauling stones, rowing boats, or working as blacksmith assistants. But if the farm needed hands, roles blurred. Everyone worked. Viking culture, with its fierce independence and warrior ethos, had little room for sentimentality toward servants. Thralls were tools expensive, yes, but disposable. If one died, another could be taken in the next raid. Yet curiously, the law codes show us something else too. There were rules about how thralls could be punished, not because the law cared deeply for their welfare, but because they were valuable property. A dead slave could not work. A maimed one could not be sold. Violence was allowed, but within limits. A master who permanently injured a thrall might be fined not for cruelty, but for damaging his own asset. And so, some restraint existed, though it was cold comfort. Imagine a young thrall girl washing linens in a freezing stream, her hands red and swollen. She can't read the law. She doesn't know she's technically protected from being unreasonably harmed. All she knows is that if she doesn't finish, she be beaten. And if she breaks a pot, she might be sold again, this time to someone harsher. Escape was rare, but not impossible. A few tried, slipped into the woods at dusk, hid in caves, made it to the next village only to be recognized, recaptured, beaten, branded, or worse, killed as an example to the others. Some made bargains, earned favor, saved scraps of silver. A lucky few bought their own freedom, but we'll come to that later. For now, imagine the quiet rhythm of daily life. The longhouse is calm after dinner. A few stories are told. Someone plays a lyre. The free family members sit back, sipping ale. The thralls clean up quiet, invisible, present only through the scrape of a spoon against a pot, the hush of bear. Feet on earthen floor, and when the fire burns low, they sleep. Not in beds, on straw mats. Wrapped in whatever cloth hasn't been used for the animals. Their dreams are short, often dreamless, because they know that, before the rooster crows hoar, the raven calls, they'll rise again, and begin again. Now, let's consider something a bit more hopeful, though only cautiously so. Not every Viking slave remained one for life. The laws allowed for manumission, the formal release of a thrall from bondage. A slim ray of possibility in an otherwise grim existence. But as always, the devil is in the details. First, understand that freedom in the Viking world wasn't a clean slate. A freed slave, known as a lesingi, gained a status somewhere between bond and freeman, not fully trusted, not entirely free, suspiciously watched, always second class. Path to this semi-freedom was varied. Some thralls were freed by generous or aging masters, especially those who had served loyally for many years. Others earned their freedom by performing a great service, saving a child from drowning, for instance, or defending the household in a raid. In rare cases, a thrall might save enough silver from odd allowances or outside labor to buy their own release. But this was as rare as snow in summer. Manumission ceremonies were symbolic. The freed thrall might be handed a sword or a hat, objects they were previously forbidden to own. This ritual told the community, this person is now different. Not equal, but changed. And yet, freedom came with strings. A freed thrall often had no land, no kin, no name worth anything. They were still tied to their former master, who now served as their patron. Their legal rights were limited. If they committed a crime, their punishment was harsher than that of a freeman. Their children, too, carried the stain of slavery in their blood for generations. Marriage was difficult. No respectable family wanted their daughter wed to a freed thrall. Jobs were scarce. Some became farmhands. Others peddled goods at markets. A few, ironically, bought their own thralls, perpetuating the very system they had once suffered. And the community never quite forgot. A freedwoman who had once been a household servant might find herself serving her former master's grandchildren, now as a maid. The distinction between service and slavery, in such cases, blurred. The sagas, those long, winding Icelandic epics, mention freed thralls rarely. When they do, it's often with condescension. A clever slave outwitting his master. A grateful servant saving the day. But these are exceptions, stories. Most former thralls lived quiet, cautious lives, always aware that their freedom was conditional. Social, precarious. In some corners of Scandinavia, freedmen banded together, formed communities, created new ties. These small groups, often on the fringes of Viking settlements, tried to build something of their own, a fresh start, a second chapter. But the land was poor, the soil rocky, the neighbors skeptical, and yet they persisted, because even a bitter freedom was sweeter than bondage. They built homes from turf. They married each other. They named their children after old gods, as if to claim legitimacy. Some even rose in status, becoming minor traders or warriors for hire. Just a few earned respect. They were remembered not as ex-slaves, but as founders, survivors. But history is fickle. Their names are mostly gone. And so we're left with the shape of their lives, the pattern of their effort, a long, hard path upward, through toil, through shame, through years of being looked down upon, but they kept going. And perhaps that's the deepest rebellion of all. In a world where they were meant to be nothing more than hands and muscle and silence, they dared to become something more. Not just tools, not just property, but people still uncertain, still watched, but standing finally on their own feet. Picture a windswept hillside, thick with moss and the smell of damp heather. The sea murmurs somewhere far off, and crows circle above, slow and unhurried. Here, a body is being laid to rest, but not with ceremony, not with song. This is not the funeral of a chieftain or a warrior wrapped in wolf pelts. No torches, no mourners, just a shallow grave, a few stones, maybe a wooden cross if the household has begun to flirt with Christianity. The body belonged to a thrall. Death in the Viking world was a transition. For the free, there were many imagined destinations: Valhalla, Folkvanger, Hell, or even the cold, dark nothingness of the grave. It all depended on how you died, who remembered you, and which stories your descendants told. For thralls, the stories often stopped at death. Few records remain of how enslaved people were buried, but what little we have suggests that their send-offs were as quiet as their lives. They might be placed near the edge of a family plot, or outside it entirely. The word property doesn't get washed away by death. Sometimes they weren't buried at all. In the rare cases where mass graves are discovered pits with bones, tangled like storm-tossed driftwood, archaeologists often suspect that many belonged to thralls. People who weren't worth individual burial, who had no kin to mourn them, who were given back to the earth in silence. But every now and then, something else surfaces. In one site in Denmark, archaeologists found a slave buried with a few grave goods, simple but personal. A comb, a bead, a small iron knife. Was this a gift from a kind master? A token from another servant? A final act of dignity in a world that rarely offered it? It's tempting to believe that even in a harsh society, small kindnesses could bloom. Because the Vikings, for all their brutality, had a concept of legacy, of memory. And while most thralls were never named in the sagas, surely some were remembered by the households they served. A loyal old man who told stories by the hearth. A woman who raised children not her own. Even in systems designed to erase identity, traces remain. Let's return to the grave. There is no feast, no burning boat, but maybe someone stands a moment longer than expected. Maybe a child, too young to understand bondage, clutches a flower and leaves it on the stones. Maybe the mistress of the house crosses herself, or whispers a quiet word to the gods her husband still honors. In this small moment, the thrall is more than a laborer, more than a tool. She is someone who lived. And that matters. In Norse belief, the afterlife wasn't always glorious. Even for the free, hell, the underworld, was a cold, gray place. Not a punishment, just the end. Most people, regardless of status, likely expected to go there. Unless you died in battle, you weren't riding to Valhalla. So for thralls, the afterlife wasn't necessarily worse. Just quiet, like their life. But death might also mean something else. Release. No more rising before the dawn. No more bruised palms or splintered feet. No more silence, only rest. And maybe, just maybe, if someone remembered your name or told your story by the fire, you might drift somewhere lighter, where you were not the thrall, but yourself, whole again. We'll never know, but that too is the nature of history. We remember what we can, we honor what we find, and we listen softly to the hush between the pages. Now, imagine you're lying on a straw mattress, staring up at the beams of the longhouse roof. Smoke stains them black, like ink spilled on an old map. You've worked since before the sun. Your hands are raw, your stomach half full. The hearth is quiet now. Everyone else sleeps, but your mind won't. This, too, was part of the Viking thrall's burden, the part that isn't written in law codes or carved into runestones. The invisible toll, the wear that didn't show in bones or scars, but lived deep in the chest, behind the eyes, in dreams that never quite settled. To be enslaved was not just to be worked, it was to be watched. Constantly, your body was not yours. Your choices were not yours. Your mistakes were punished, and your silence was expected. You had to anticipate the moods of your masters. Learn to read their footsteps, smile when asked, fade when not. You became a shadow of yourself. Even among other thralls, trust was fragile. Some were newly captured, others born into servitude. Some were loyal to their masters, others seethed quietly. But all knew that one careless word could mean a beating. Or worse, there are no surviving Viking letters from thralls. No journals. But we don't need them to understand what long-term powerlessness does to a person. We see it in the echoes of every other society that practiced slavery. The same patterns. The same emotional weight. Hopelessness, isolation, a kind of inner folding. And yet resilience too, because people adapt, even in the worst circumstances. Some thralls carved out meaning in small ways. A rhythm to the day, a friend by the cooking pots, a child to care for, even if not their own. These tiny sparks kept the soul from going dim. Still, it was a life of uncertainty. A thrall never knew what tomorrow would bring. A sale, a punishment, a new owner, a voyage across the sea. Even good fortune could be threatening. A new master might be harsher. A friendly mistress might be replaced. And so the mind learned to brace, to stay small, stay safe, stay invisible. Many probably forgot what hope felt like, or avoided it, lest it betray them. Can you imagine that? Living year after year without control, without the ability to say no, without even the illusion of safety, with every relationship colored by dependence, every interaction filtered through fear. And yet you go on, because you must. And sometimes, in those stolen moments stirring, the pot, mending the cloak, humming a half-remembered lullaby, you remember who you were, who you still are, somewhere deep beneath the layers of silence. That memory is resistance. Viking society rarely acknowledged the emotional world of its thralls. You weren't expected to feel, only to function. But humans are humans, even when stripped of rights, even when crushed under the weight of ownership. They dreamed, they remembered, they missed home. They mourned, and in that they remained whole in ways their captors never fully understood. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine that quiet mattress again, the rough straw, the chill air, the distant snoring of the goats, and in the dark, a whisper of a song, just a hum. A memory of a mother's voice, a language you no longer speak aloud, but one your soul still knows. Imagine a bustling Viking marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of salted fish, damp wool, and smoldering embers from nearby hearths. Traders shout softly to one another over the low hum of bartering voices, clinking coins, and the occasional bray of a tethered animal. But among the goods displayed woven cloth, sharpened blades, carved bone trinkets stand another kind of commodity. Men, women, and children, their freedom stripped away and their futures uncertain. The Viking slave trade was not a mere footnote. It was a vast, shadowy network that connected far-flung parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. From the frozen shores of Scandinavia to the sun-baked markets of Baghdad, human lives were bought and sold as part of an economic system that shaped and exhausted everyone involved. Slave trading was both business and brutality, a constant flow. That sustained Viking wealth, but also imposed a relentless human cost. Captured in raids or wars, many thralls were marched in chains to distant markets, their lives folded into the rhythm of transactions. Some were sold nearby, in town squares, thick with mud and noise. Others were shipped across seas, transported on creaking longships, the deck crowded with shackled bodies and the scent of salt and fear. The traders were clever. They knew how to price their cargo. Strong young men could fetch higher sums. Women and children were often sold for less, but their value wasn't just monetary. They were prized for domestic labor or potential brides in foreign households. One can imagine the silent terror behind the eyes of those standing under the trader's gaze. No promises, no guarantees. Only the slow grinding of an unseen machine. Markets operated on a schedule, with fairs timed to gather large crowds. When traders from faraway lands brought exotic goods and foreign slaves. The crowds often didn't see the human cost beneath the spectacle. In some cases, the trade was subtle. Slaves might be exchanged as part of diplomatic gifts between chieftains or kings, tokens of alliance or submission. In others, raids were launched expressly to capture more thralls, fueling a vicious cycle. Interestingly, the Vikings weren't unique in this. Many societies of the medieval world practiced slavery, but the scale and reach of the Viking trade were notable. Slaves were shipped down the rivers of Eastern Europe to Byzantine markets. Others found themselves in the Arab world, where their skills or bodies were exploited in various ways. And yet, amidst this, stories of resistance flicker. Some slaves managed to escape the markets, fleeing into forests or mountains. Others blended into local communities, their origins quietly forgotten over time. There are accounts, though sparse, of slave revolts or uprisings, small but fierce attempts to reclaim autonomy. For the free Vikings, the slave trade was a source of wealth and power. But for those caught in its web, it was a constant exhaustion of spirit and body. The marketplace was not a place of choice, but a place of fate, the endless shifting of hands, the cold calculations behind the sale price, the desperate hopes of those who prayed for mercy. And so, beneath the clamor and bartering, the marketplace breathed a darker rhythm, a shadow dance of commerce and captivity. Now, imagine the morning mist over a Viking settlement. The village awakens slowly, the crackling of fires, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of wooden cups. Amid this waking world, there is a distinct relationship at play, that between master and thrall. It might seem strange to think of loyalty where chains bind, but Viking society was complex. Thralls were not simply property. They were woven into the fabric of household and community, albeit in a subordinate position. This relationship, often marked by tension, could sometimes develop into a peculiar form of loyalty. Consider the thrall, who had served a family for many years, who had witnessed births and deaths, feasts and famines. She might take pride in the order of the household, in the quality of the bread baked for the family, or the cleanliness of the hall. Her identity, in part, was tied to her role. Yet this loyalty was double-edged. It was shaped by survival as much as affection. A thrall who earned the trust of her master might receive small privileges, a lighter workload, a better sleeping spot, or a chance to earn some silver. This trust could make her life marginally easier, but it also reinforced dependency. Sometimes the oath of loyalty was formalized. In certain sagas, we hear of thralls who swore oaths to protect their masters, sometimes even fighting alongside them. In such cases, the bond could be fierce. The master depended on the thrall's service, the thrall on the master's protection. But the nature of this loyalty was never simple. It was born of fear and hope, of obligation and strategy. Thralls. Who resisted were punished. Those who submitted sometimes gained a fragile security. For the free Vikings, loyalty was a virtue often celebrated in epic poems and sagas. But for thralls, loyalty was often a necessity, an act of adaptation rather than choice. The bonds of trust between master and thrall could be fragile. A new master might be cruel, breaking any old ties. A thrall could be sold away at a moment's notice, severing relationships built over years. Imagine the quiet sorrow of leaving behind a hearth you once cleaned with care, a child you helped raise, a dog that recognized your voice. And yet, loyalty could also be a form of resistance. By fulfilling their duties well, thralls carved out a space for themselves, small islands of stability amid the turbulence of enslavement. This complex web of emotion, fear, hope, dependence, pride defined much of thrall life. It reminds us that even in the harshest circumstances, human connections endure, that the ties which bind can be both chains and lifelines. Tonight, as you rest, think of those quiet mornings, the slow rising of smoke from the longhouse, the soft steps of a thrall moving through the shadows, tired, watchful, and ever loyal in her own way. Imagine the creaking of wood and the steady splash of oars as a Viking longship cuts through the misty morning waters. The sea is calm but cold, and the sky is a pale sheet of gray, whispering promises of storms to come. On board, the crew moves with practiced rhythm, each action precise, efficient. Among them, shadowed by the rowers and warriors, are the thralls. To be taken on an expedition was a mixed fate for a Viking slave. For some, it was a terrifying ordeal. Bound to the oars, muscles burning, faces slick with salt and sweat, rowing hour after hour. The oars were heavy, the benches hard, and the journey long. The sea air was sharp, carrying with it the scent of brine, wood smoke, and the distant call of seabirds. For others, an expedition might offer a brief taste of freedom, a chance to prove worth, to glimpse lands beyond the cold forests and farms, where their lives had unfolded in shadows. But even this fleeting hope was undercut by relentless exhaustion. The longship was a place where every member had a role. Thralls were often placed at the oars, their backs bent to the task, their breaths ragged in the chilly air. Their hands, already calloused from farm work or household chores, gripped the oars with grim determination. The rhythm of rowing was both hypnotic and punishing. Hours passed with the tide, the waves rocking the ship in slow, endless motion. There was no rest until the shores of their destination appeared, and even then, the work continued, unloading supplies, setting up camps, carrying loot. Many thralls were also tasked with maintaining the ship, repairing torn sails, tending to equipment, or preparing food. Their work was constant and critical. One can imagine the mental toll, the ache of muscles, the sting of salt water on skin, the chill of night air penetrating threadbare clothing. The sun might bake the deck by day, while the wind cut like a blade by night. The thralls' presence on the ship was not merely functional, but symbolic. Their labor fueled the Vikings' famous mobility, their ability to strike swiftly, to raid, to trade, to explore. Without thralls, the longship's power was diminished. Yet despite their importance, thralls were often treated as expendable. If the voyage went badly, or if provisions ran short, their needs came last. They were often the first to be left behind, traded, or sacrificed. Some expeditions ended in bloodshed on foreign shores or among internal conflicts. Thralls might find themselves caught between warriors, their lives hanging by a thread. Others were left behind in foreign lands, taken as new slaves by other peoples. But within this harshness, there were moments of quiet humanity. A thrall might share a scarce meal with a fellow servant, whisper a lullaby to a child on board, or steal a glance at distant horizons, imagining a life beyond the waves. The longship was a vessel of both opportunity and oppression. It carried Vikings to glory and thralls to hardship. As you settle into rest, picture the longship rocking gently in the dark, the muted creak of timbers mingling with the whispered breaths of those rowing in the shadows. Now step softly into the warmth of a Viking longhouse as dawn breaks. The air inside is thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, peat, and earth. The flickering glow of the hearth casts long dancing shadows on timber walls. Here, the thrall, begins another day. Daily life for a Viking slave was a constant flow of chores labor that underpinned the household survival, yet often went unnoticed in the saga of Viking heroes and battles. Imagine the thrall stirring a pot of gruel over the fire, the dull clatter of wooden spoons against the iron cauldron mingling with the low murmur of the household waking. Her hands are nimble but worn, stained by soot and toil. She moves deliberately, knowing that the warmth of this meal will carry the family through another day. After the hearth is tended and meals prepared, the thrall's work continues outside the house. Fetching water from a nearby stream, carrying bundles of firewood, tending to livestock cows, pigs, chickens, all rely on her care. The smell of damp earth rises as she pulls weeds from the garden, plants seed, or repairs woven fences. The work is hard, backbreaking, but necessary. Inside, she cleans the floors with brooms made of twigs, sweeps ashes from the hearth, and repairs clothing with thread and needle. Every stitch mends not only fabric, but the delicate balance of household life. Thralls might also be tasked with caring for children, guiding their small hands to learn weaving or helping them gather berries. This role could bring fleeting moments of tenderness amid the hardship. The rhythms of chores follow the seasons. In summer, there is planting, harvesting, and preserving. Autumn demands preparation for winter's chill, chopping wood, salting meat, weaving heavier cloth. Winter is a time of maintenance, mending, and careful rationing. Each task, though repetitive, was part of a larger cycle. The thrall's labor was the backbone of the household economy, a constant, invisible pulse. Yet even in this relentless routine, there could be moments of beauty. The soft dawn light through the smoke-stained windows, the delicate pattern of frost on the garden soil, the quiet companionship of a dog resting by the fire. But these were also days of limits and boundaries. The thrall could not choose her work, nor her hours. Mistakes could bring harsh punishment. Complaints were dangerous whispers. In some households, a thrall's skill and diligence might earn her small privileges, a better place to sleep, the chance to keep a portion of harvest, or occasional permission to visit nearby settlements. Still, such allowances did not erase the fundamental inequality. Imagine the thrall's hands at the end of the day cracked, dirt-smudged, and trembling with fatigue. The longhouse settling into quiet, the household resting while she remains. Alert, guarding the hearth, waiting for the master's final commands. This, too, was a form of endurance. And as you listen, let your breath slow and your mind soften. Picture the longhouse in evening's glow, the fire's embers fading to warmth, and the quiet footsteps of one who labors unseen. Imagine a quiet morning mist settling over a Viking village, where smoke rises in thin spirals from wooden homes, weaving into the cool air like ancient prayers. The sound of distant chanting, or the rhythmic tapping of a rune carver's chisel, echoes faintly a whisper of faith and superstition. For Viking thralls, religion and magic were threads woven into the fabric of their daily existence. Though often from the shadows, their lives were marked not only by labor, but also by spiritual practices, sometimes enforced, sometimes embraced in hope or desperation. While the free Norse embraced the gods Odin, Thor, and Freya with grand rituals and sacrifices. Thralls had a more complicated relationship with these divine figures. Their position was precarious, caught between fear, survival, and a yearning for protection. Imagine a thrall clutching a small carved amulet, a Thor's hammer made of bone or stone tucked secretly beneath her cloak. This simple talisman was a shield against harm, a charm to guard against sickness, or a silent prayer for endurance. Magic permeated daily life. Runes, the ancient alphabet, were more than letters. They were symbols of power. Thralls might see runes carved into household objects or etched onto weapons. For some, learning a rune's secret meaning was a form of subtle rebellion, a way to find strength in a world that sought to deny them agency. Superstitions abounded. A thrall might avoid stepping on a crack in the floor, whisper prayers to the land spirits before going to the fields, or hang herbs by the door to ward off evil. But religion was also a tool of control. Masters often invoked the gods to justify their power or the social order. Thralls were reminded that their place was ordained by the will of the gods, that obedience was both duty and divine mandate. In some cases, the line between sacred and profane blurred. Rituals to appease spirits might include offerings of food, or small sacrifices to ensure the household's prosperity or to keep illness at bay. The gods could seem distant or capricious, and in such uncertainty, thralls might turn to personal magic spells whispered under breath, charms fashioned from bones, or curses muttered in secret against cruel masters. One story, passed down in Saga and Whisper, tells of a thrall woman who carved runes onto a piece of wood, hiding it beneath her pillow. It was said to protect her from harm, and though she was sold away from the household, she carried the talisman until her dying day. This spiritual life was often invisible to the free, a quiet undercurrent beneath the grand halls and feasts. For the thrall, faith was a place of refuge and resilience, a way to endure, to hope, and sometimes to resist. As you listen, picture the flickering shadows cast by a small fire, the soft scratch of a rune being carved, and the gentle murmurs of prayers, carried on the wind echoes of an unseen world that shaped even the most exhausted of souls. Imagine a night deep in the Nordic forest, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds, the wind whispering secrets through the pine needles. Somewhere, a thrall stirs, restless, heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Escape was one of the faintest lights in a thrall's life, a dangerous, elusive dream that promised freedom, but demanded great courage and sacrifice. Running away from a Viking master was no simple matter. The landscape was vast but unforgiving, full of hidden dangers, wild animals, harsh weather, and the ever-present threat of capture. Thralls who fled risked severe punishment if caught, not just for themselves, but sometimes for their families left behind. But some dared. Escape could mean slipping away in the dark, moving silently through forests and over rocky hills, guided only by the stars or whispered advice from sympathetic neighbors. Others used moments of chaos raids, storms, or celebrations to slip. Their bonds, the road to freedom was long and uncertain. Many ran toward the settlements of other peoples, Christian monasteries, foreign villages, or isolated farms places where their status as thralls might be unknown or unclaimed. In some cases, thralls found ways to blend in, taking new names, learning new customs, and living quietly on the margins of society. Others were taken in by outlaw bands, finding a rough camaraderie among those living beyond the law. Resistance took other forms, too. Not every act of defiance was flight. Sometimes it was subtle a refusal to work at full speed, a secret sabotage of tools or crops, whispered curses against masters, or small acts of kindness toward fellow thralls. Such quiet rebellion was dangerous, but it was a way to reclaim some measure of control. It was a refusal to be broken completely. Stories of resistance were often told in hushed tones, passed down in sagas and songs. They remind us that even in the darkest chains, the human spirit flickers with desire for freedom. One saga tells of a thrall who, after years of service, orchestrated a daring escape for herself and several others. They fled into the wild, surviving on wit and courage, and eventually earned their freedom by joining a free clan. These tales offer a glimpse of hope, a counterpoint to the relentless exhaustion of thrall life. And as you settle now into your own quiet space, imagine the soft crunch of footsteps on forest leaves, the cold night air filling lungs with fresh possibility, and the heartbeat of those who dared to dream beyond the chains. Picture a fire-lit hall, long and echoing, where a skald and old storyteller sits cross-legged, weaving tales as the flames flicker and cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The people gathered listen, faces half-lit, eyes drifting between wakefulness and the gentle pull of sleep. Among these stories, thralls appear often not always as central figures, but as quiet, shadowy presences at the edges of grand Viking sagas. These stories carry fragments of truth, glimpses into a world that many prefer to overlook. They speak of thralls not only as servants, but as complex individuals, sometimes loyal, sometimes rebellious, sometimes tragic. In the sagas, thralls are often portrayed with a mix of sympathy and pragmatism. Their lives are shaped by hardship, but also by moments of cunning and courage. Imagine a saga telling of a thrall woman who cleverly outwits a cruel master, using her knowledge of herbs and whispered magic. Or the tale of a thrall who saves a chieftain's life, earning a fragile freedom in return. These narratives remind you that thralls were more than mere property. They were part of the human drama, the fragile weave of power, loyalty, and resistance that defined Viking society. Yet, the sagas also reflect the limits of memory and perspective. Thralls rarely speak for themselves in these stories. Their voices are filtered through the eyes of the free, shaped by the needs of storytelling and social order. The silence of their own stories is a quiet echo, what was lost, what was left unsaid. Still, the sagas preserve a faint pulse of thrall life, the exhaustion, the hope, the small rebellions hidden beneath the surface. As you listen, imagine the fire's glow softening the harsh lines of the longhouse, the gentle crackle of burning wood, and the skald's voice weaving history and humanity into a soothing lullaby. Now, turn your attention to the opposite side of Viking society, the chieftain's chamber. Here, life was marked by power, wealth, and a striking contrast to the thrall's world of toil and subjugation. Imagine the great hall, its wooden beams, carved with intricate designs, thick tapestries hanging from the walls, and a roaring fire blazing in the hearth. The air smells of burning pine, spiced mead, and roasted game. The chieftain reclines on a carved bench, surrounded by advisors, warriors, and family. His robes are rich, made from dyed wool and trimmed with fur. The gleam of bronze jewelry catches the firelight. This was a place of decision, diplomacy, and display. The chieftain's comfort extended even to his private toilet, a stark contrast to the communal. Exposed latrines where thralls might relieve themselves under watchful eyes. His privy might be a simple wooden structure, perhaps set apart from the main hall, lined with soft moss or straw. A small attendant might be nearby, ready with a basin of water or a cloth. Here, power was exercised not just in battle, but in daily life. The luxury of privacy, choice, and comfort was a visible marker of status. Yet, even in this chamber, life was not without its tensions. The chieftain bore the weight of leadership, the demands of loyalty, and the ever-present threat of rivals. Still, his daily life contrasted sharply with the endless labor of the thrall. This contrast highlights the social fabric of Viking society, a web of interdependence and inequality. The chieftain's world was built, in part, on the backs of those who labored unseen. As you breathe deeply, imagine the warmth of the great hall, the low murmur of conversation, and the soft rustle of robes. Reflect on the fragile balance of power and dependence that shaped these lives, so different yet inextricably linked. Imagine the long twilight of the Viking Age, when the world that shaped thralls and masters alike began to shift like sand beneath weary feet. The great halls grew quieter, trade routes altered, and the old gods' shadows slowly faded beneath the rise of new faiths and kingdoms. For the thralls, these changes brought uncertainty, and sometimes unexpected opportunities. The Viking Age was not static. It ebbed and flowed with time, like the tides on the rugged northern shores. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, new laws were written, and the social structures that held thralls captive began to strain. Imagine a village where a former thrall, once bound by chains and commands, now walks more freely. The old bonds of servitude were not instantly broken, but the shifting tides meant that some slaves gained rights or were granted freedom for service or faith. Yet for many, life remained a relentless struggle. The collapse of old Viking networks, disrupted livelihoods, famines, wars, and political upheavals spilled over the lives of common people and thralls alike. The once clear lines between master and servant blurred as feudal systems grew, bringing new kinds of dependence and obligation. Archaeologists today uncover the remains of these times, bones that tell stories of hard lives, tools worn smooth by use, and homes that grew smaller or vanished altogether. Imagine walking among these ruins, feeling the echo of footsteps long gone, sensing the lingering presence of those who toiled, dreamed, and survived amid the shifting world. The saga of the thrall did not end with chains thrown down or doors flung open. It was a slow, complicated fading, like the last light on a cold horizon. And in this fading, we find a quiet truth, the resilience of the human spirit amid relentless hardship, the whispers of freedom amid oppression, the soft hope that even the most exhausted can carry. As you drift gently into rest, picture the fading, light over a Viking settlement, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the soft, steady heartbeat of history itself. Now, settle yourself by an imagined hearth, its flames glowing low, the warmth spreading softly into the cool air. The day's stories have drawn to a close, but the embers of thought still glow gently. What can we carry from the life of a Viking? Slave into our own restless nights? The thrall's story is not merely one of chains and hardship. It is a lesson in endurance, in the quiet strength found in the smallest acts, a shared meal, a whispered prayer, a stolen moment of rest. Imagine the thrall's hands, cracked yet steady, shaping not just wood or cloth, but the very fabric of survival. In their exhaustion, there is a reminder of our own fragility. In their small rebellions, a spark of defiance that echoes across time. And yet, these stories are also a mirror reflecting the vast changes in how we live and think about freedom, dignity, and humanity. We may never face the harsh realities of a Viking slave's world, but we carry their echoes in our understanding of labor, of power, and of hope. As you lie down now, let the rhythm of their lives, so distant yet intimately human, soothe you. The steady work, the quiet courage, the moments of connection amid adversity. Let this calm reflection be your guide into sleep, a soft bridge from the harsh world of the past to the gentle comfort of your present. The hearth dims, the night deepens, and with a final breath, you join the countless souls who have found rest beneath the same stars. Sleep well.